Hi, good morning. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I am to speak to the proposition that Bangalore is India's fastest growing tech city. So what I'm going to do is unpack that proposition in three sections. The first being why the claim that Bangalore is India's fastest growing tech city viable. What does the rising cultural sector or the cultural scene in Bangalore look like, and what a convergence of it currently looks like, and what it might look if we paid a little bit more of an attention to it. So I often like to say that, thank you, in India we have a very strong professional conversation around science. We do not have a cultural conversation around science and tech. And that's lacking. And therefore then, when you look at Bangalore as a new science city or a tech city, that has consequences. That has cultural consequences, that has social consequences. So to speak to why Bangalore is what it is today, it's been called the Garden City of India. At some point, historically, it had a range of botanical gardens, but also other kinds of gardens, so huge attention to horticulture. It changed its identity very soon to a military city with the arrival of the British cantonment, and that also fed into earlier history and the making, for example, of something called the Bangalore Torpedo. Those of you who've seen Saving Private Ryan, at some point Tom Hanks shouts, "Bring out the Bangalore, bring out the Bangalore." Those would be those. They were built off of Tipu Sultan, who was the king of Mysore, who, in collaboration with the French, had built these rockets, which were the first known use of ballistics in warfare. And those then were transformed and made more modern by the Madras sappers in the city of Bangalore, and that's how they came to be called Bangalore. So I'm doing like a potted version of the history as to why the military industrial academic complex contributes to Bangalore being what it is today. At independence, major public sector units were moved to Bangalore, the Bharat Electronics Limited, which made radios for free India, the Hindustan Machine Tools, which made machine tools like lathes and milling machines and that kind of stuff that's required to industrialize, so the machinery for industrialization, but also watches. And then in the 80s came the tech boom, or India's own version of a sort of service sector revolution, the information technology revolution, as it's called. Revolution aside, you know, I mean, I guess in a world where we are right now, as in us here, revolution might have other meanings. So just to give you a few statistics, over 400 global R&D centers in the city alone, 4,000 startups, the largest number of India's unicorns. But then again, in this room, we might not believe in unicorns, but that's a different story altogether. There are also academic institutions that allow for this kind of coming together of science, engineering, and industry. So sort of renowned academic institutions, but also accelerators and industry accelerators that in a way build between these academic institutions and the R&D centers of global multinational corporations that sit in Bangalore. Now, adjacent to it, some of these statistics, if any one of you wants, there are two large reports that I'm happy to share with you later. So, recently, and by recently I mean the last few years, we've seen the rise of a number of cultural institutions. Cultural life, of course, has been abundant in Bangalore like it has been elsewhere. But when we talk about a professionalization around it, institutions, spaces, funding support, we've got a few museums that have opened in less than 10 years in the city. So the Indian Music Experience, the Museum of Art and Photography, a Indian Museum of Currency or Indian paper money, a Bangalore International Center that sort of convenes different kinds of cultural activities across the city and has become a major hub, the National Gallery of Modern Art and Science Gallery, which I've had the privilege of leading the establishment of. Apart from that, there are a bunch of institutions. I promise you it all comes together. Institutions that support then the cultural life that has grown over time. So art schools, design schools, 4 of them, major ones. Again, in a city of 13 million, 4 doesn't feel that much, but And then there are public spaces for thinking about science and technology. Now, as you can see, there are a number of them, but I'll still maintain that the cultural conversation on science and engineering is missing. So again, a bunch of spaces and venues, including bookstores, that allow for interesting things to happen. Now, I've shared with you what the tech startup engineering ecosystem looks like. So there's R&D centers of multinational corporations, there's Indian science and engineering institutions of eminence, and there's a growing scene of theaters, museums and museum-like institutions, venues for cultural activities, hubs for cultural activities. They come together, or not, in interesting ways, because in the first instance, the rise of museums, for example, in Bangalore, or museum-like spaces, and bookstores that hold events, and cafes, and breweries, both coffee and beer, microbreweries. So I often call Bangalore the city of bros and brews. Now, I made the mistake of saying that once to a journalist, and she wrote it down as bros and booze, and that got printed. I'm still living it down, but that's what you have in the city. It's alive. It's got a sort of. If I were down there, I'd say contrived. Since I'm up here, I'll say a slightly sort of. How should I put it? A Silicon Valley vibe, or an attempt to create a Silicon Valley vibe, and so the microbreweries and the coffee kind of speaks to it. Of course, Bangalore is a coffee drinking region with lots of coffee plantations around it. So this tells you this is a real image. So now, bringing it all back together, what has happened is that because of the rise of the R&D centers and the tech ecosystem, there's disposable income and there's the attempt at leisure. Therefore, such institutions become possible, such platforms become possible, but they become possible almost in a manner such that the artists or the cultural institutions or cultural producers are the blind spots in this landscape. There is no place for the inclusion of what cultural producers, and by cultural producers I'm not talking about, for example, the setups of places like the Mill or Technicolor, which also have a part of their offices or headquarters in Bangalore. So I'm not talking about the industry aspect of it, but actually the artists on the ground, the boots on the ground that actually make cultural life, including theatre and museum work, possible. So those are literally the blind spots of this ecosystem. Now, there are efforts in the city, in international partnership, but also within the city, to bring about this convergence and to make possible a conversation that is cultural about the presence of new technology, especially ones that need a cultural, social, political conversation like artificial intelligence, new gene technologies, climate change, so on and so forth. And now the new spaces, hopefully, will allow for that conversation in a manner in which it hasn't happened until now. Science Gallery Bengaluru, where I am, is one such space, but there are others who are also equally trying to do so. It is therefore a pleasure for me to also take note of a report that we have also contributed to, which will be released today by the British Council, called Art and Technologies in India. It's an effort to map the landscape, but also suggest where this convergence is possible. This convergence is required also because we don't have in India arm's length funding and convening bodies like the Arts Council here, or for that matter, funding of the kind that the AHRC offers for humanities and social sciences to be able to think about the presence of new tech and its integration into cultural life. And so such a report is actually quite important. There's an effort on part of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry to bring together these two sides, so to speak, in a conversation. Often it stops at funding and corporate social responsibility. So there's funding here. Can we make our tech park more interesting? Or can we have more theatre on our premises? But it's not at the level of systematically nurturing the arts, the humanities, and the social sciences such that the arrival of new tech is not a UFO landing into a setting, but actually one where people are able to have conversations about the meanings of the kind of work that is happening in the R&D centers, in the academic institutions dedicated to science and engineering, and what it might mean for a good cultural life to grow out of this in the city. Thank you very much for your attention.